meetings. I would just like to emphasise a few of its points. Hopefully members of the committee are taking part from a place where they are not disturbed or distracted. When they are not actively participating in the meeting, I would ask members and officers to keep their audio and video on mute. Anyone wishing to speak should use the raise hand function, and I will call them when it's their turn to speak. Please remember to unmute your video and audio when I call you to speak. Any councillor with an interest in any item should declare it and keep their audio and video muted when it is being considered. They will not be included in any vote on the subject. And finally, when it comes to a decision or on any recommendation, or when it comes to a decision on any of the recommendations or motions before us, I will assume that if nobody says that they oppose them, everybody will be in agreement. If anyone says that they are opposed, I will ask for a formal vote to be conducted. If we lose live stream on the website, I will adjourn the meeting for 10 minutes and hopefully the problem can be fixed. If it cannot, I will adjourn the meeting until a future date.
Right, I'll just run through the apologies for absence for this meeting. We've had apologies from Councillor Sampson, and the councillors we have attending the meeting live tonight are Councillors Dan Clarke, Councillor Jenny Large, Councillor Malcolm Sismy, Councillor Malcolm Watson, Councillor Natasha Dudley, Councillor Paul Clarke, Councillor James Raven, and our Chair, Councillor Nora Walsh. We're also joined tonight by Lisa Clampin and Barry Pryke from our external auditors, BDO. And the officers present are Alison Chesil, Mandy Fay, myself as the Democratic Services Officer, Elizabeth Brooks, and Susanna Clarke. Thank you.
Okay, so if we move on to the second item on the agenda, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of December 2019. Is everyone happy to approve those minutes? I guess we'll take that the minutes are approved by everyone and everyone's happy with those. The third item on the agenda is a declaration of interests. So does anyone have any interest to declare on any of the items? No, so we'll move on to the fourth item on the agenda, which is the public question time. No questions have been submitted by a member of the public. So as there are no questions, we can move on to the fifth item on the agenda, which is announcements. There are no announcements outside of the announcement I made at the beginning of the meeting. And with that, then we can move on to the sixth item on the agenda, which is the public sector audit appointments, PSAA update, which will be presented by Amanda Fahy.
Thank you, Chair. And good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Fay, Director of Financial Services here at Chelmsford City Council, and I'll be introducing this first report before you this evening, which is an update on various matters relating to the Public Sector Audit Appointments Limited, or PSAA as they're known. So PSAA are the body responsible for appointing the Council's auditors and for setting the scale fees for each audit year. At its previous meeting, the committee asked for an update to be provided following a scheduled meeting between Essex finance officers and a representative from PSAA, which was being held to discuss the issues that have been faced by many local authorities in the completion of their audit for the 2018-19 audit year. And the issues discussed are set out in the report and included auditor resource, which we had discussed a number of times throughout the course of our various meetings, and the pressures facing auditors in terms of tight timescales and focus on audit quality, particularly in the wake of a number of high-profile business collapses. So the message was the scope of the auditors was expanding, their work was expanding, and there was certainly a potential for fee increases in the future. The conclusion drawn from the meeting really was that this may well be a longer term problem that the auditors were facing in terms of ongoing resource issues and this increased expectation and the scope of their delivery. Subsequently, the Council received a consultation document for the proposed scale fees for the 2020-2021 audit, so not the audit year we're currently auditing, but the following year. And this consultation set out some of those increased pressures and the amended standards which the auditors would be required to apply, which again in turn may put pressure on fees. As appendices to the report, we've included the consultation that was provided to us and the consultation response, which, because that fell between meetings, was drafted between myself and the chair and returned by the deadline. And then some further communication from PSAA, which continued to set out some of that background in terms of what they were doing, speaking to auditors, and what auditors were doing in terms of managing their resources. And finally, we've also now received the final scale fee for 2020-21, which I'm pleased to say the initial scale fee is the same as for the current year. However, there is scope within that for auditors to locally negotiate any increase in fee if there are particular pressures or additional work in the audit of a particular authority. So PSAA have chosen to keep the base level as was, but with that element of local negotiation, which would be brought to the audit committee for consideration if that was to arise, and to note that PSAA also sign off any proposed fee increase themselves. Inclusion, I'd just like to draw members' attention to the very last part of that final scale fee letter, which talks about the implications of COVID-19. And due to the pressures on public authorities and auditors as well, there have now been some revised dates for the publication and audit of the 2019-20 accounts, which are now the 31st of August for publication of the draft accounts and the 30th of November for the final audited accounts. Thank you.
Councillor Watson, your hand's up. Do you want to?
I'm afraid we can't hear you, Councillor Watson. Sorry, we appear to be having problems hearing you.
Yeah, I think we aren't able to hear Councillor Watson's question. So wondering if Councillor Watson can type his question in the meeting chat. Possibly, if that helps. Okay, so Councillor Watson. Oh, sorry, Amanda. If you...
No, sorry. I was just going to respond. Say yes, thank you, and I'm sure we will be talking early on with BDO if there are any issues about increased fees, and that's exactly the advice that we are getting, to talk about those issues as early on in the process as possible, because there may be mitigation around those issues or things we can do differently to ensure that an increase in fee is not required if we discuss that early on in the process. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions on this section? Okay, so if there are no other comments, then I suggest that we approve this report and recommend the report from the Audit Committee. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 7, which is the external audit, annual audit letter, which is presented again by Amanda Fahey.
Barry Pryke at BDO will present the annual audit letter, Chair.
Okay, so section 7 is presented by Barry Pike from BDO. I just noticed Councillor Malcolm Smythe, you've got a question.
Yes, going back to the last item, you asked us to approve the report. The recommendation was to note the report, which is surely more appropriate.
Yes, that's correct. Sorry. I'm recommending to note the report.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if that's all on item 6, then moving on to item 7, which is the external audit, annual audit letter, which is presented by Barry Pike from BDO.
Thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm Barry Pryke. I'm a senior manager with BDO, the council's external auditors. So we have a number of items on the agenda this evening. The first is the annual audit letter. So this summarises the results of our work on the audit of the 18-19 financial statements, and also our work in relation to our use of resources opinion for the 2018-19 financial year. So the purpose of the annual audit letter really is to present in as easy to read a format as possible the outcome of our audit. The aim is that the letter is concise and just highlights the key issues. I won't go through all of the details in the annual audit letter, but what I will do is just draw the committee's attention to a couple of key points. So on page 36 of the agenda pack, or page 3 of the annual audit letter, the committee will note there is reference there to material misstatements and unadjusted audit differences. So I'm pleased to say that during the audit of the 18-19 financial statements, we didn't identify any material misstatements. We did identify some unadjusted audit differences. None of those were material, and it's also important to note that the nature of those issues were such that they didn't have an impact on the bottom line, so the council's general fund. Moving through the report, There are some further details on some of those issues that we picked up, particularly on pages 38 and 39 of your agenda pack, which just highlight one unadjusted misstatement in relation to revenue and expenditure recognition. And on the following page, also some unadjusted misstatements relating to land and building valuations. But as noted, none of those had an impact on the bottom line. There's also on page 40 reference to the pension liability valuation and the work we did in relation to that. Just to confirm to the committee that the matter reported in the results section on that page is the same as the issue that was reported to the committee back in September last year, when we'd already identified this and addressed it. And the amounts involved were adjusted by management in the 18-19 financial statements. Similarly, on page 41, the issues reported there in the results section will hopefully be familiar to the committee as they're consistent with what was reported in September 2019. I didn't want to say any more about the annual audit letter, but I'm obviously happy to take any questions arising if there are any.
I guess there are no questions on this item on the agenda. So in light of that, I suggest we move to item 8 on the agenda, which is the external audit 2019 to 2020 audit plan report, which again is presented by Barry Clarke from BDO.
Thank you. So this paper sets out the key matters relating to the 1920 audit, covering obviously the audit of the financial statements and our work on use of resources and the value for money opinion. The covering report draws members' attention to the key sections and those items in the report that we consider to be most relevant to your understanding of our audit process and our risk assessment in particular. So again, I don't propose to go through the report in detail, but just to draw members' attention to a couple of key points. The first matter to highlight is in relation to materiality. Which is the threshold that we use to drive the amount of testing that we do and the particular items of account that we audit in the financial statements. That's increased from 1.75% of gross expenditure on net cost of services as set last year to 2% for 1920. So it's a slightly higher threshold, and that simply reflects the fact that we have a developed understanding of the council now following our first year of audit last year, and it also reflects the outcome of last year's audit where there were a limited number of issues identified. In terms of the matters that we will report to committee, if we do identify any misstatements and they remain unadjusted, the threshold for that has been set at £63,000 for 1920. So in our audit completion report, we will include any misstatements that are above that particular threshold. The next section of the covering report just refers to independence and fees. We can confirm that we comply with the Financial Reporting Council's ethical standards for auditors, and in our professional judgment, we are independent and objective within the meaning of those standards. As highlighted in the report, the core audit fee for 1920 is consistent with the prior year. However, in paragraph 3.3 of the covering report, the committee will note that we have just highlighted there that the scale fee as set doesn't reflect some of those changes that Mandy was talking about previously when she was running through the PSAA scale fee consultation process. So in particular, there are some areas of our audit which require more depth in terms of our audit effort and more attention to estimates and some more detailed work around those areas. So in terms of these additional procedures and the fact that they're more extensive, there is consideration given to the extent to which the scale fee may not accommodate those anymore. And we will have ongoing discussions with the council in terms of the impact for the 1920 audit of those issues on our scale fee. If there are any variations proposed, we will, of course, bring those to the audit committee following discussion with officers. And it's worth highlighting as well, again, as Mandy pointed out, that any variations are subject to review and approval by PSAA as well. In terms of the audit risks in relation to the financial statements, the risks will probably be familiar to members from the prior year, particularly those in relation to management override, valuation of the net pension liability and valuation of land and buildings. It's probably worth noting that clearly current circumstances and particularly the impact of COVID-19 on some of the estimates in these areas. So, for example, the value of property that the council owns, the values of investments, and also the valuation of the liability in relation to the net pension liability recognised in the balance sheet are likely to be heavily impacted by COVID-19, particularly in terms of the uncertainty surrounding some of those judgments that will be made by the experts that the council engages to support those valuations. Those significant risks were already in our audit plan because they're areas that we recognise are subject to a high degree of estimation uncertainty in normal circumstances. And certainly now that degree of uncertainty has increased. We will obviously report back to the committee when we've completed our audit on our findings in those areas, but we're continuing to discuss with officers how COVID-19 might affect some of those balances that are recognised in the financial statements. In terms of the value for money opinion and our use of resources work, we've identified a significant risk around financial sustainability. I don't think it will be any surprise to the committee that the sector is clearly facing a degree of uncertainty in terms of financial position of councils, and that is across the board. That was the case again before COVID-19, but current circumstances have introduced a greater degree of uncertainty there. So again, it's worth noting that we had identified that risk prior to COVID-19, but we will be considering the impact of COVID-19 as part of our work on that risk. And again, we'll report our findings when the audit is completed. One other matter in relation to the report, the planning report, that I just wanted to draw members' attention to is our responsibilities in relation to fraud. So what we do ask every year is that if members of the committee are aware of any alleged actual or suspected instances of fraud that we wouldn't be aware of as external auditors through the formal reporting channel. So, for example, any reports that come to this committee, we would ask members to contact us directly just to make us aware of those. Our contact details are in the report, and obviously we will be able to discuss those with you should you have any concerns. Finally, I just wanted to provide members with an update on the 1920 audit. So we have already commenced some of our what we call substantive testing. So that's the detailed testing in areas such as income and expenditure, including payroll, also areas around community infrastructure levy income, Section 106 grants, and also our work around the valuation of property. We have commenced that work as well. That work was commenced in March as part of our interim visit, and that just helps bring some of the detailed work out of the final audit visit, which, as the covering report notes, is currently scheduled for September. That was all I wanted to say on the 1920 planning report. Lisa, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to what I've said. If not, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Are there any questions? Councillor Watson, you have asked a question on the chat.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, yes.
Well, given the substantial financial difficulties we're facing with our loss of income, how will you cover that aspect of giving your opinion on the organisation as a going concern?
So in the public sector generally, and that includes local government, the going concern assumption is based on the continuation of services. So even if an organisation was not to continue in its current legal form, it would still be considered a going concern on the assumption that the services, certainly the statutory services that it provides, would still continue. So the going concern assumption in the public sector is slightly different to the way it's treated in the corporate sector, where clearly, liquidity issues, poor cash flow, and so on would call into question the going concern assumption and the preparation of the financial statements on that basis. In terms of the potential impact of COVID-19 on the income that the council receives, we will pick that up as part of our use of resources work. So we'll look at the work the council's doing around its medium-term and short-term financial planning, I expect, and particularly the forecasts for income. But it's worth noting in the context of the financial statements, the preparation of those financial statements on a going concern basis, on the assumption that the council will continue to operate in its current form, is appropriate. Is appropriate in the context of the public sector interpretation of going concern.
Thank you for that clarification.
Okay, thank you, Barry, for that presentation. Does anyone have any other questions or comments on this item? Okay, so if there are no more comments, then I suggest that this committee notes the matters highlighted in this report.
Agreed.
Thank you. So I'm afraid I've made a mistake. If we could go back to item 7, and which is the external audit annual audit letter, and just as Councillor Smysie pointed out, that if we could again just revisit this, and that the committee notes the matters highlighted in this report.
Agreed.
Great, thank you. So moving on to agenda item number 9, which is the housing benefit subsidiary assurance procedures for 2018-2019. And this item again will be presented by Barry.
Subsidy return for 2018-19. So the committee will probably be aware that each year the council's external auditors undertake a piece of assurance work on the housing benefit subsidy return, which is submitted to central government and just sets out the amount of money that the council has spent on housing subsidy during the year, which is reimbursed by central government. In terms of the approach to this particular piece of work for 2018-19, there were no significant changes to prior years. So just to summarise briefly, the work that we do involves undertaking a sample of 20 cases from the rent allowances benefit type and the non-HRA rent rebates type. We review those initial cases and we check that they have been assessed properly and that the benefit that's ultimately been awarded and is recognised in the subsidy return is correct. We also look at the outcome of the work in the previous year, and where errors in cases that were tested in the previous year were identified, we look to do testing on those particular errors in the current year. So the covering report there sets out the summary of the findings that come out of that work. It's also worth noting we do also do some work around the housing benefit system, so the system that is used to administer benefits, just to make sure that that's been set up correctly in terms of the parameters that are in the system, and also in terms of the version of the software that's been used to prepare the subsidy claim. The full details of our findings are set out in the appendix to this report, which is the assurance report that we sent to the DWP, and that sets out all of the findings that arose as a result of the work. The covering report just summarises those findings, and in section 3 of the covering report, the conclusion, it just outlines the impact on the final claim of our findings. And the result of our work was that the final claim was amended to increase subsidy by £1,125 to £42,041,147. So in terms of the matters identified and the impact on the claim, not a significant change in the context of the overall value of subsidy expenditure and income in the year. The conclusion section of the covering report also refers to extrapolated errors. So these are errors where it's not possible to say for definite what the impact would be. So it might be that we couldn't reasonably test every single case that might be affected by a particular error. And when that happens, what we do is we extrapolate the errors we have found across the population that could be affected by those errors. And as you'll see, the numbers are reported there. Those numbers are submitted to the DWP, and it is then for the DWP to take a view on whether or not they want any additional work performed. And in this instance, I'm not aware that they came back to either us or the council asking for anything further to be done. Again, I'm happy to take any questions on that report if there are any.
So there are some questions on this section. Councillor Watson.
Yes, I think this is an excellent report, and I think it's a credit to our officers that I think as Mr. Pike just announced, the adjustment to the subsidy was only just over £1,000 on a 42 million subsidy claim. I think our officers should be congratulated for the accuracy of the work that they've done. All the adjustments seem to be relatively minor. I think the committee, I think we should thank our officers for their excellent work during the year on this.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Watson. Councillor Large.
Hello. I had a question about the sample of 40. So there were 10 cases listed as having identified an error, which is about 25% of cases, which seemed quite high to me. I know the overall adjustment is not very large in comparison to the total, but I wondered if that was kind of normal.
So the testing where we pick 40 initial cases to test, the nature of benefits is often that it is a fairly complex process, the assessment of an individual circumstances to determine the benefits the housing benefit that they're entitled to. So it's not unusual to find errors when we do that initial testing, and as the committee will see in terms of the detailed report which sets out errors that were picked up last year, I think that reinforces that point that it's very unusual to undertake this piece of work on a benefit subsidy claim and not find anything, and that is just the nature of housing benefits. So I suppose from my point of view, that didn't stand out to me as a particularly high error rate. It's also worth noting that the errors will often vary between the cases, so it's not necessarily that they were all wrong for the same reason. There can be different parts of the calculation that are incorrect, for example, or it might be that a wrong rent has been used for some reason. It could be any one of a number of issues. And as I say, that reflects the complexities of benefit claims. So I don't think from my point of view, it's unexpected to find errors and that level of errors either in the initial sample. It would be nice, obviously, to not find anything, both for ourselves and officers, but the practicalities of the process mean that that's unlikely.
Okay, thank you.
And Councillor Watson, did you have a second question?
I didn't, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
No. Okay. Are there any other questions on this item, agenda item? Okay. I thank Barry again for coming here tonight to speak to us and to present the 3 reports. If there are no other questions, then I recommend that the committee note the findings reported to the Department for Work and Pensions in the Reporting Accountants Report Appendix 1.
Agreed.
Thank you. Apologies, I think I was on mute. Moving on to agenda item number 10, which is the internal audit plan COVID response. And this will be presented by Elizabeth Brooks.
Sorry, can you hear me now? So had Audit Committee gone ahead in March, we would have brought our full 2020 plan to committee for approval in line with our normal practice. However, due to the impact of COVID-19, it obviously isn't appropriate or prudent to commence delivery of that plan yet. So this report set out the approach we've taken instead to support the Council at this time. As per paragraph 1.2 of our report, our immediate priority was and is to work closely with services and risk management to understand where there have been any changes to processes and procedures, particularly financial ones, which may increase the Council's exposure to loss or fraud or reputational damage. And we have done that in the ways as outlined in paragraph 1.3. Here we describe where we've already provided some control design advice for the small business grants process, and we will look to undertake some post-payment assurance on this too, to ensure that payments are valid and have gone to genuine claimants. And we're working closely with the Revenues and Benefits Manager and the Investigations Officer on this. We've also helped design controls around activity at the new community hub, such as making sure that referrals are recorded, as purchase card activity, and any costs incurred, and we'll continue to monitor that as the hub continues. We've contacted all relevant service managers, especially where services are still operating, to capture any changes, offer any advice accordingly, and document any of those changes. And that will allow us to monitor any exposure and inform future work plans, and also crucially ensure that when we do go back to business as usual, that those usual controls are reinstated if and when appropriate. We're also intending to distribute some general advice and guidance, and this may come in handy actually in this sort of next phase, because the future still looks very unclear, and whether we return to normal, whether we return to a new normal, or indeed if we had to go back into lockdown. We just think that actually having that advice there for people that they can refer to will be really, really useful. It also will allow a route to ask us as auditors for any advice and report any concerns as well. And as my last point on that paragraph, should any committee members have any specific concerns at this time, then please do let us know. moving on to as when we hope business as usual will be restored in paragraph 2.1. Our intention is to deliver a revised audit plan, still obviously focusing on the highest risks, and we will continue to liaise closely with risk management to ensure that any emerging risks from this response phase are included where appropriate. And we intend to bring that plan to you in September, as we hope things subside in the next few months, and managers are better able to refocus their priorities. So our timing of those reviews will be much more appropriate. And then just in the final paragraphs in 3.1 and 4.1, I just wanted to reassure committee that we still are able to provide our annual report and opinion, which will come to committee in June as normal. We had done sufficient work already in 1920 to be able to do that. And we are still able to work effectively remotely as a team, and we've adapted our approach accordingly. But we will obviously continue to reassess that and change that if that changes, especially if that has any impact on us being able to provide any assurance or on the audit opinion. So thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Are there any questions? So if there are no questions for this agenda item, I recommend that the committee note the contents of this report and support the internal audit approach during the Council's COVID-19 response phase.
Great.
Thank you. So moving on to agenda item number 11, which is the Internal Audit Charter for 2020. This again is presented by Elizabeth Brooks.
Thank you. So the Internal Audit Charter is coming to you today. As you may be aware, we have to bring this to committee every year. Normally it would be appended to our annual plan, so it would have come in March, but coming today instead. This document is a requirement of our public sector internal audit standards, and it essentially sets out internal audit scope and authority for how we operate, what our purpose is, so committee and senior managers know what assurance they can take from our work and what our position is in the organisation. Just to note, there are no material changes to this document. It's essentially the same as you received last year, so I won't go through it in great detail again, so unless anybody had any specific queries or concerns about any of the content.
Does anybody have any questions or comments on this section? So if there are no other comments or questions, then I recommend that the committee note the contents of this report and endorse the Internal Audit Charter for 2020.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to item 12 on the agenda, which is the risk management report for spring 2020, and this is presented by Alice as well.
Hello, thank you, Chair. So I'd just like to run through the Spring Risk Management Report, agenda item 12. This report covers 3 areas. It updates the committee on progress to date for the year. It talks about our priorities for the coming year, and then we have the summary of the Principal Risk Register for Audit Committee. So in Appendix 1, there's a summary of the work we have done this year within the risk management team, which is detailed in paragraph 2.3, which really highlights the key areas of work we've been undertaking. which is strengthening and embedding the Principal Risk Register framework for management team and working with service managers to get the quality of work required in that document. We've aligned our risk criteria to the internal audit standards, and we've worked alongside internal audit team to make sure that our terminology and framework is aligned with theirs. We've reviewed the risk data within the current risk information system. There's over 500 risk piece of information in there, risk indicators, etc. So we've reviewed that, streamlined that, and also done a bit of a data cleanse there. And we've developed our risk criteria in terms, we've made it slightly more sophisticated in our scoring and tweaked in terms of feedback our risk criteria. So does anyone have any questions on that summary, section 1? Okay, section 2, the priorities for for the immediate future are talking around the COVID-19 impacts that we've already discussed at this committee. We've been working very closely with the business continuity planning and internal audit functions, helping the control environment and risk decisions being made. We have highlighted any changes, key changes for the internal audit colleagues, and also worked with identifying and helping decision making in the current risk environment, which is, as you can imagine, a very difficult environment for all officers trying to deliver their services with the impact of change we've had to deal with. The second priority is we're looking to implement a new risk management system which is an additional element of our enterprise resource planning system, which the finance team are leading on the implementation of the finance model at the moment. We're hoping to integrate this system, which will enable the authority to have an integrated financial system with performance, risk and compliance sections within the financial system to clearly embed the risk management framework, help us work with risk identifiers, and just generally improve our risk information and risk reporting. So that's quite a large piece of work, which we're starting very soon, which should be going live in November. And we will then be reviewing our risk framework after the first year of the new framework we've been working on, getting feedback from management team and key stakeholders, and just reviewing our situation there. I've got a question. Have I? Are you going to ask the question? Is there any questions on section 2?
Yes, Councillor Paul Clarke.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Item 2.2, when this is rolled out, is the audit committee going to have access to this reporting tool, or is it just for management? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I don't think it's been decided yet, to be honest. We haven't got to that level of implementation within the plan, but we can certainly consider view access to the summary of the risk. I will take that forward to the project panel. Thank you. Is there another question?
There's one from me, if I may, Chairman.
Sorry. Yes, sorry. Councillor Watson has a question. Sorry, I was on mute.
Thank you. Are there any cost implications of replacing Pentana with this new system, or the cost of that being covered by the whole digital strategy budget?
Thank you for the question. It's a very marginal increase in hundreds of pounds increase from the Pentana system, and the budget does currently reside within digital services.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so and no more questions on those two sections of the report. So the final section of the report, which is Appendix 2, is a summary of the Principal Risk Register. Now, within the new framework, we bring the Principal Risk Register summary to Audit Committee twice yearly. And this focus, as you can imagine, has been on our updated work within the risk framework is on the COVID-19. What we've decided to do, instead of having it as a standalone risk due to the severity and the scale of the situation we're in across all services, COVID-19 has been considered across the entire risk framework and with all risks. So as you will see in section 4.4 of the report, there are three main risks that have been identified in a negative impact way with regard to the current situation. The first one is the income and the financial position. Again, Barry highlighted that previously in this committee meeting about the significant impact of our income stream, which will be addressed with our normal revenue monitoring and medium-term financial strategy, which will be reviewed by Director of Finance and Accounting Manager. Fraud has also been increased due to the unfortunate situation we're in. It's perceived that there's increased motivation and uncertainty around the financial situation for many residents, to be honest, and within the potential economic situation, we feel that there's an increased risk. Plus, we've had to operate in a different way, and as Elizabeth has already pointed out, that some areas have changed the way they've worked. So we're not saying that actually is an instance of risk, but we're expecting that there's going to be a high instance of risk of fraud going forward. And our business continuity response has been impacting negatively. Even though we've responded incredibly well to the current situation from an emergency planning position, we feel that right now, at the moment, this risk register only went to management team 2 weeks ago. The reason we've increased that is because if we had a business continuity situation right now, because we're working in an emergency situation with our Essex Resilience Forum response and the response phase we're working in, that would be it would just be incredibly difficult for us to respond fully. So they're the three biggest changes due to COVID. There are some other changes highlighted in 4.5. 2 risks has been removed from this version of the register since Audit Committee last saw it. The UK no deal sort of Brexit risk has been removed for the moment until we have further details going forward. And the digital programme risk has been removed and will be replaced by a new risk which is being refined and worked on at the moment, a new risk identifier information, which is about the change to technological risk instead of the actual digital program. We've got an emerging risk, a new risk on the strategic register, which is a combination of strategic and operational risk, and that is the risk of failure of delivering on the climate emergency plan. We believe that it's a significant delivery for the authority, and at the moment it's in its infancy, so that's a new risk on there. It's not highly rated, but it is identified and one that the management team want to track. And the other risk that's changed is the Bewley Park North East Bypass Station due to some funding uncertainty, as I understand it, around that risk. Any questions on the principal risk summary?
I think Councillor Paul Clarke, you have a question.
Hello.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I don't know whether you was about to cover the heat map at the end of this report or not, but since the point I was going to make is on 4.5, what concerns me, particularly in light of us discussing the local plan next week, is the upgrading of risk to possible from unlikely on Bewley Park and the North East Bypass, and the effect it would have on the funding for those projects on our local plan, because one of the biggest issues that comes up when I talk to residents is the amount of housing we produce without the infrastructure to go with it. Now, I know that the station and the bypass is not a Chelmsford project. It falls under the remit of the County Council, which is why I wanted to know why it was in that report. And if it's in there because of the impact on the city, maybe the Army and Navy should have been on there as well, because that's also subject to funding, and we haven't even had the plan, the actual plan out, the 5 options agreed on yet. While I'm on here, was there a 4.6, or have I not got the one that hasn't got 4.6? It goes from 4.5 to 4.7 on your report.
All right. Okay.
Okay. Was there a 4.6, or am I missing it? But the point about these fundings is we're in unknown territory, and the local plan is just bad timing on what's going on. I'd like to think that they're going to be committed to the funding for this, but if they haven't, it's going to impact on us in a dramatic way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. To answer the why is this on there and not the Army and Navy question first, we look at our plan priorities and look at the risks around delivery of our plan and our priorities, and these are the ones that the management team and us as senior officers have decided that are the, within detail within our plan that are relevant to terms of delivery. So that's why that they've been combined. Actually, Beaulieu Station, Chelmsford North East bypass have been combined as a risk. In terms of the specifics around the re-rating, all the re-rating goes to our management team to consider and approve, and this rating has been as you'd expect within risk. They change due to information that's provided, and it has been up and down and up again a couple of times actually, and it's due to the professional officer who's leading this project opinion on the delivery of the likelihood of the funding. And I suggest if you've got any real specific questions on that you could direct them to them. I don't know if anyone else has got any other answers on that. It's we're providing a summary of the framework of the officer's opinions at the time. And like I say, it's a continually being reviewed these projects, and the likelihood and assessment of risks is reviewed at that same time.
Can I just come back to that? Sorry.
No.
Who would be the officer who made that risk assessment?
It would be Stuart Graham.
What, on Beaulieu and North East bypass? Okay.
He's the one that's been dealing with this for us.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Did you have another question, Councillor Clarke? Or
no, that was it. Thank
that's
you.
it. No, your hand's down now. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions or comments on this section? Okay. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks.
And if there are no other questions or comments, I recommend that the committee note this report, including the principal risk summary, at 6th of May 2020.
Agreed.
Thank you. So moving on to agenda item number 13, which is the accounting policies for the 2019-20 statement of accounts. And this is presented by Susanna Clarke, Principal Accountant.
Hello. Yes, accounting policies. They are the general specific principles that we applied when we prepared the statement of accounts. It's best practice for us to bring them to you prior to approval of the statement of accounts. They need to comply with the Code of Practice on Local Authority Accounting, which is published and reviewed every year. The 2019-20 code did not bring any specific significant changes. Therefore, we didn't actually need to change our accounting policies from previous year. Apart from removal of some accounting policies, they're related to non-material items. This is something that's encouraged by CIPFA for us to do, to streamline the accounts, make them a bit more concise and easier to read for the user of our accounts, and to remove unnecessary detail. I would also like to bring your attention to some areas of the accounts where we need to apply judgment. As Barry from BDO already mentioned, there is an increased level of uncertainty around these areas, for example, for valuation of assets or calculation of our provisions for non-collection of bad debts, because it is difficult time for us to estimate as to what will be the full impact of the government's measures to the economy. Is there any questions?
Okay, thank you, Susanna. Are there any questions or comments? And if there aren't any, then I recommend that the Audit Committee, approve the accounting policies to be used in the preparation of the accounts.
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to agenda item number 14, which is the Audit and Risk Committee Work Programme. And this will be presented again by Elizabeth Brooks, Audit Service Manager.
Thank you. So this is the Audit and Risk Committee work programme. You'll all be familiar with this. It comes to every committee and essentially sets out the rolling work programme of future meetings. Generally, it hasn't changed, and you'll see the reports that are due to come to June and beyond. The only slight change from previously is that due to COVID-19 and the impact on the timing of the Council's annual accounts, an additional meeting has been proposed for November 2020 to finalise those accounts, which is on the list. But other than that, it would be as expected.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Are there any questions on this agenda item number 14? So if there aren't any questions or comments, then I recommend that that the rolling programme for work for the committee is agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of the agenda items. Agenda item number 15 was urgent business. There aren't any items for urgent business. And unless anyone has any comments or questions on anything, then I suggest that we close the meeting. And thank you all for your time tonight.
Thank you, Chair. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.